Hey, I want to talk about 1920s prejudice. We've already talked about peace, we've talked about prosperity, we've talked about prohibition, but what about prejudice? What's going on here? Well, during the Great War, the Soviet Union was formed. The old Russian Empire was a mess, and they were losing so many people in the war and there was open rebellion, and people turned to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and his Bolshevik revolution. And they were a Marxist revolution, which means they were communism. They sought to overthrow the capitalist system and impose a government-controlled command economy called communism. And Americans were not very happy about this socialism, and so they became very paranoid about immigration. We're going to see a resurgence of nativism, this fear and dislike of immigrants that's going to come in, and they're going to further tighten immigration quotas. They're going to work very hard towards deporting people who have beliefs who are socialist, and many of them coming from Eastern Europe are going to have a lot of these socialist ideas that they're going to bring with them. This idea of getting rid of or changing the government into something that would enforce equality, land redistribution, a lot of things like this. And so that fear of that communism is going to be partially what leads to this resurgence of nativism. Latin America is also going to there's a lot of Marxist activity in Latin America, and so we're not going to be real happy with Latin American immigration either, because there's this fear as immigrants come over. Remember, the world is a mess after the Great War. In Europe, empires, the German Empire is gone, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is gone, the Ottoman Empire is gone, the Russian Empire is gone, and they've been replaced by other things. Of course, it's not like there's a big hole in the ground where they used to be, but there's this massive displacement of people. And so there's this idea in America that the immigrants are going to bring not American ideas with them, and they're going to change America too much. And this response to World War I, they don't want that. See, World War I saw a spike in patriotism and love in country at first that's going to later go away with the lost generation. But during that the World War I, that hyper patriotism leads to the point of nationalism. And I think when I think of the difference between patriotism and nationalism is love of country. And nationalism is love of your nation and an absolute disregard or dislike of other nations. And we go from being patriotic to being very anti-German, anti-Slavic, anti-Russian, we see a huge uptick in anti-Semitism. This anti-Jewish sentiment. People like Henry Ford actually sponsored groups that we would consider neo-Nazi now, that were, and he published, he paid to have books published about how bad Jews were. And so because they weren't seen as American, you couldn't rationalize how you could be this and an American, how you could be from another country and an American. And the other group that really suffers during this time are, I guess nowadays we'd say people of color. That term, I guess, has kind of come back into vogue, right? But African Americans, Hispanics, Asians. We're going to see an uptick in violence against these groups, these minority groups. And we're going to see a uptick in the violence against Native Americans, American Indians, all these different groups. We're going to see that uptick against them because they're either not white or they're not Protestant. And so this is going to be the absolute heyday, the most powerful time for the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. They're going to have more members. They're going to have more influence during the 1920s than they ever did, even during the time period immediately following the Civil War. And what did they do? They got rid of they ended the Reconstruction by acts of terrorism. And during the 1920s, they essentially, they're white nationalist terrorists in our country, that they would burn their crosses, the flaming word of God. They would, uh, people were very open. Yeah, of course, this person's a judge and they're a member of the KKK because they're a good person and they're fighting for American values because that's what the KKK does. Um, but they were also doing things like they were if you didn't hold your hat in your hand. When you were talking to a white person, you may find yourself drug out of your home at night and lynched. The situation is going to be so bad that there's a song that's going to come along later called Strange Fruit, where African American were lynched. They were, these extrajudicial killings were oftentimes done by hanging. And almost every community had a tree that was the designated hanging tree. And so you would go and you would see they were killing so many minorities that it was just, what's that strange fruit hanging in that poplar tree? And they would just, until eventually they just leave the body there. Because if you go and try to take the body down, you may find yourself the victim, the next victim. That level of racial violence that comes along. In South Texas, there's actually going to be a flat-out race war during the 1920s, where you see people coming from Mexico that are Marxist. And they're going to come in and they're going to say, hey, listen, we're going to start a revolution in Texas. And we are going to take Texas back to Mexico and we're going to make them into a Marxist state. So now we have a threat against Texas. We have a threat against our capitalist system, Marxism. And we have this race, this people that look different from many other Americans. And so the Texans, particularly the Texas Rangers and the sheriffs and such like this, are going to respond violently. For example, they may get word that there's a person named Rodriguez. And this Rodriguez, he shot and killed a rancher, a person who owned some land because, I don't know. So what they do is they would go and they pull people over. Hey, what's your name? He says, well, my name is Jose Rodriguez. Aha! And then they go and they kill the person in the road because his last name was Rodriguez, and they never bothered asking, "Are you the same Rodriguez that we're trying to find?" And just to make sure that they got the right Rodriguez, they may go and continue searching for other Rodriguezes and leave their bodies on the side of the road as a warning against other Hispanics not to mess with Texas. And then the Hispanics responded by gathering together, and they would go and they actually went into some people's houses and killed everybody in them, all the whites that were in there, in response to a kind of a revenge for what had happened on the side of the road. And so you see this rapid escalation, and unfortunately, that was not terribly uncommon, this escalation. And there's plenty of blame to be thrown around this prejudice and this hatred that's going on. But I think the thing that is probably, when it comes to prejudice, probably the most visible and is, I mentioned Hollywood in one of the other videos, I think. Hollywood is going to actually promote this prejudice. People would say they still do. But they're going to promote this prejudice by playing into racial stereotypes. I think when I was a kid, I used to love Zorro. And it's a funny story, but there is actually the actor who played Zorro for the Disney show was a Mexican American. Well, Zorro is a Mexican hero. Zorro is the Spanish word for fox, for example, right? But you couldn't have a Mexican American on television, so he had to change. He was a Mexican American who had to change his name to an Anglo name so that he could pretend to play a Mexican. Let that soak in for a minute. So we have this Mexican American has to pretend to be white so that he could be on television to play a Mexican. That's the kind of thing that Hollywood was putting out. Lots of racial stereotypes, if you've seen, and Disney has disavowed a lot of these things, but like Disney, some of these shows like the Lady and the Tramp with the Siamese cats, there's I think 14 Bugs Bunny cartoons that the owners of Warner Brother have sworn they will never air, and Ted Turner, the owner, has done everything he can to gather up all the original plates and prints and lock them up and make sure they never see the light of day, because they're very racist and very stereotypical. Like instead of Snow White, it was coal black, and it says Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. It was coal black and the seven jazz players or something like this, and it was really really racist. But probably the most racist of all the movies was a movie called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was hailed at the time as being a technical and cinematic achievement. It was 3 hours long. It was the very first feature-length film Hollywood ever produced. And we'll watch some of it in class, but the gist of it is this, that after the Civil War, blacks threatened the whites. That all the former slaves wanted to do was make the whites into their slaves and rape all the pretty white women. And so the KKK comes to the rescue of white virtue and white government and saves the day. And it was hailed as an achievement. And the guy who did it, W.B. Griffith, actually did it. He said, to show how far Africans have come from the days when they were slaves. What ended up happening is that people would leave the theater and they would actually be so mad at the film that they would actually go look for African Americans to beat up. On more than one occasion, they would find young African American men and kill them because of the scenes. And they claimed, well, I just saw Birth of a Nation. I see how you really are. And would beat them up in places like Indiana, that hotbed of racism in Indiana. And so it was a time of really, really bad prejudice. I guess, again, Hispanics, African Americans, immigrants, there was plenty of prejudice to go around. It seemed to be the only thing that there was plenty of. And so anyway, so we'll talk about some of these things in class, but until then, don't forget to also look at the video about peace, prosperity, and prohibition, and I will see you in class.